very brightly colored and it's very loud, and it's fun for a while.
We want to be free to do what we want to
The two were
do.
Muhammad Ali and Sonny Barger, the president of the Hells Angels.
This is 1095. Well, look, welcome to the podcast. I'm obviously here. We're here to talk about your book, which I finished today, actually. I've been reading it for, 6 weeks or so. I had a few pages left today. And, really enjoyed it. I thought a good starting point, the very end of your book actually quotes some lyrics by Tony Bennett, who, funny, I've seen a lot of artists over my time, a lot of musicians, and he was one person that I missed in concert. And I always remember because it was a few years ago, and I think he played somewhere in Asia, in Singapore or somewhere, and I didn't have a chance to get over and see him, which was a real shame because I missed that opportunity to see.
Me too. I never saw him either.
Oh, really? Well, there you go. Well, you obviously, I suppose as an intro, great for our audience, before we get into the book, just to give a bit of background on your history, because it's obviously relevant to maybe not Tony Bennett on his own, but the music industry, of course.
Sure. Let me know when you are we rolling now?
We're rolling, man. Yeah, we're good. We're good.
Well, I worked as a pop culture journalist in the Twin Cities from the mid 70s to the early 90s. And then I went into public relations work, which was kind of night and day. I covered a lot of things happening here in the Twin Cities, a region that produced Prince. I interviewed Prince when he was 17. He just gotten a huge record deal from Warner Brothers, and I got to know him pretty well through the years. I had a lot of social interaction with him. Minneapolis is kind of a big, small town when you spend any time here, especially in the music community. And also the rise of all the new wave bands that came out of here, the Replacements, Husker Du. There was also a parallel comedy scene here that produced a lot of national talent, including Louis Anderson, the late, great Louis Anderson. Liz Winstead, who went on to be the co-founder of the Daily Show. And a host of other guys and women, many of whom ended up in Los Angeles working as writers and producers. So it was a pretty rich time. I interviewed Bob Dylan, which had always been literally one of my dreams. I've had Bob Dylan dreams for decades, and I'm not sure why. I've already interviewed him. I still have the occasional Dylan dream, but he's a powerful figure. He's a powerful archetype, too, I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
That was my stint in popular culture. I always did some freelance writing on the side, even after I left the profession of journalism and moved into PR work.
And the book, the book touches on the stuff you did, but obviously the bulk of the book is around your PR work, particularly with Greer. But before we go into that, why this book? Why now? What makes it different, I suppose, to all the other books out there, which are kind of UFO focused, if I can call it that?
Yeah, those are good questions. I was a space nerd as a kid, always interested in outer space. I wrote to NASA when the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo space programs were launched. They sent back packets of information about like this thick, included autographed pictures of the astronauts, which
awesome.
was pretty cool. I put them up on my wall along with images of the Beatles and Rolling Stones, and I got interested in the UFO issue probably about the same time. There wasn't a lot of coverage of UFOs and or ufology at that point in the media. But high school friends and I had a sighting. I think it was my sophomore year of high school. I grew up in a remote rural area in western North Dakota, which for people who may be geographically inclined with the United States layout. It's kind of in the center of the country, and it borders Canada, and it gets very cold there in the winter. Bitter cold. I mean, it gets bitter cold here in Minneapolis too, but particularly worse out there. It's wide open prairie and plains. But we saw in the middle of a very cold February night, large oval object hovering over the farmland just west of our high school, which sat on the edge of town. And there'd been quite a few UFO sightings in that part of the state throughout the week, reported in the newspaper, radio, and television. So 4 of us were out there in the parking lot during a varsity basketball game intermission. And one of my friends said, "We should get in the car and go over there and get a closer look." And I was the fool who said, "No, we don't even have our coats on. We have a good basketball game inside." That's what everybody's been reporting across the state this week. So let's just go back inside. I wish I'd had that one to do over. But 3 days prior to that, walking to high school with probably one of my lifelong best friends who I've known since we were 5. He's my attorney today. He's mentioned in the book quite a few times, and so are these memories. We were walking to a student council meeting again, the dead of winter that week, and we're going through a large park called Rocky Butte Park. It was actually a butte, the highest landmark in that part of the state. It's very flat out there. And from the top of a butte, this small red orb came down and hung in front of us. It was soundless. There was no sort of communication with it. We obviously didn't know what it was. We still don't know what it was today. In fact, that's one of the narratives that runs through the Space Pen Club book.
Indeed, yeah.
It's trying to sort out what these sort of high strangeness experiences that I've had throughout my life, if they're related to the ET issue or if there's some other paranormal condition or environment that we've yet to really begin to understand.
So when just to drill in on that, and the red orbs, obviously, you talk in the book about the ones in your bedroom in the middle of the night, which we'll get to, but the one that you saw before that, I assume it was. So when you say, was it kind of here in front of you, or are you talking something that's, kind of tens of meters away, or what is
No, it was about 10 feet in front of us at eye level.
Wow.
And we had discussion about it while it was there. And neither one of us can remember how this episode ended, other than the fact that we obviously went to the student council meeting because we were student council officers, big men on campus. My friend Jim was also known as Zod in the book.
Yeah.
He was president and I was vice president, so we had to be at that meeting. But we don't have a recollection, probably just because it's been a long time ago. But I think the thing just obviously dissipated, and we shook our heads and went on our way.
And what the ones that, I mean, just for the audience, in the book you talk about, and I'm paraphrasing here, let me know if I get it wrong, but you wake in the night and there's more than one. There's a number of orbs, right, that you see literally within your bedroom. And isn't your wife at the time asleep next to you? You don't wake her. Eventually, I can't remember if they go or if you just kind of decide to go back to sleep. But what I suppose, if I'm not getting that right, correct me. But also, what, have you kind of rectified in your head what that is, or you've just gone, no idea, may never know?
Probably the latter. I'm probably never going to know what that was. The 5 little red orbs, as I say in the book, after this episode, I tried to reconcile where the 5 little red orbs that appeared in the bedroom related somehow to the 1 little red orb that appeared in the park like 20 some years earlier.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about the bedroom experience, number one, I was only awake for about 30 seconds of it. It was 4:03 in the morning. I know that precisely because the digital clock sat at the foot of our bed on a dresser, and there were two orbs at the foot of the bed, another one over to the right of the dresser, another one closest to the window where my side of the bed was, and then a fifth one right near my head, which really startled me because it seemed to be inside and outside of the room simultaneously, which it sort of defied the laws of physics and or maybe perception or physical matter. And the minute I noticed the fifth one, I glanced again at the clock to make sure, in fact, I was awake, and it was still 4:03. But now the two prominent ones at the bed that had been set up like this, kind of equidistant from each other, were moving equidistantly in opposite directions, and then I blacked out.
Right.
But 2 hours later, when I got up to walk our dogs, I noticed some residual effects from this, and it was very unpleasant. The top of my head, around the crown chakra, seemed to flare up, like with goosebumps. I can't think of the medical term. That would happen 4 or 5 times during the day and into the next day, and then slowly that also dissipated. But I felt like my soul had been sucked out of me. I had no energy. I had no willpower. I was just kind of dazed and confused, to use a stoner
Wow.
term.
Wow.
So I made some calls about it, tried to discern what had happened, and eventually, at one point, after I'd been immersed in CSETI, Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, founded by Dr. Stephen Greer, I was hypnotized by one of our advisors to kind of explore this incident, and that's covered pretty thoroughly in the book, that whole explanation, to try to discern what these were, if they were ET in nature, if they were something else. And I never reached any sort of conclusive closure on that either. But it's something you don't forget.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, it's super interesting here you tell the story because, if I was interviewing you and you're a ghost hunter, you could have a completely different spin on that, right? Particularly the red and if you were from Christian origin and the relationship to the devil and the hair and all this stuff. It's and I'm not religious in that way, but it's when you talk about it, I think your perception of it. I mean, it sounds like you were just open-minded with it, but it could be taken in lots of different ways. And of course, then the one that was not really here or there, which is kind of almost, having done LSD in my life and things like that, where that stuff can happen and can give you a real idea of how powerful your mind is. But there's all sorts of different ways you could kind of perceive that, right?
Yeah, in fact, it's funny you should mention the devil, because the first incident in the park, my friend Jim turned to me and said, "What the hell is that?" And I spontaneously said, sort of in jest, "It's the devil," because we're good Catholic boys. It was red, it kind of came out of nowhere, went back into nowhere. So, I mean, there's, lots of possible interpretations for it. A supernatural thing or an interdimensional thing opening up. Surprisingly, I spoke with a UFO researcher from Brazil, and at a conference one time, and we were sharing UFO sightings we'd had or information we wanted to discuss. And I asked him about these little red orbs, and without missing a beat, he goes, "Oh, those are the grays. They're shapeshifters." And I went, "Okay." Where is your proof for that statement? So, I mean, that's the sort of frustrating thing you find in ufology. In fact, I joke a couple times, although somewhat in seriousness, that this book is really my farewell to the whole UFO issue, because I'm tired of looking for answers. I'm tired of seeking for,
Excuse me.
what is the truth? A friend of mine the other night said, you're like Fox Mulder from the X-Files, trying to get to the truth of what's really happening with this issue.
Yeah, well, I mean, this not necessarily your book, but my kind of interest has been kind of re-energized in the last few years. And as a kid, I was always looking up at the stars. I still do. I live in a really very fortunate. We live in a valley where we can see, I don't know, 15 k's, to the other side of the valley. We don't have any kind of light pollution and amazing stars. And I've always kind of stared up and just tried to fathom the distances, and then kind of make that kind of relative time equation in my head, because you start to just see history rather than anything else. But yeah, that has not been something in my life for 20 years or so, or longer. But the last few years, because it's become so much more topical again. I mean, when you started with this, I mean, I think a lot of people were not laughed at, but it wasn't taken at all seriously, right, in main circles. And now there's a real kind of dialogue happening around this, which I'm somewhat suspicious of, but also excited at the same time, because when governments are releasing information, you've always got to think there's an ulterior motive. But what's your kind of view on what, you've got the 2017 kind of disclosures, and then you've got more recently, what was it, a couple of years ago, and now I listened to a Rogan podcast this week with Ryan Graves, I think his name is, one of the pilots, one of the FA,
yeah.
Which is so fascinating, because there you're listening to someone who is just a skeptic who flies a fighter jet, who is talking about really, real evidence around this stuff. But putting the real evidence side, what is your view on why this is coming to light now, and why the government is, why people are kind of releasing, or governments are releasing this information now?
I'm going to answer that, but first I'm going to answer another part of your last question about my book and what makes it different. And I think it is really different from the literally thousands of UFO books out there. Number one, it's a memoir. It's a historical, cultural, and personal memoir. While it looks at a lot of some of the best or well-known cases in the UFO research, it's not really a book about, it's not case studies. It's me trying to get at the truth and making my way through what Dr. Greer used to call the UFO ghetto. When I first met him, I thought that was such a great expression, and he tried to sort of distance himself from the craziness that happens in that subculture. But, that's what I was going for in the book, to try to get inside the crazy and sometimes amusing culture of ufology, with its researchers, astronauts that I met, indigenous medicine men that I encountered, debunkers, some high-profile media folks and TV programs, and fellow truth seekers, plus some people I knew from the music industry.
Yeah.
Who had really startling experiences and sightings, including Prince's first manager, Owen Husney, who shares a very detailed close encounter of the second kind out in some farmland west of here. And then that subsequently, like 6 months later, he had an experience in his bedroom at 4:00 in the morning, where he said, after my first instinct was that I was being, there was a burglar in the house. My next intuitive feeling was that who was ever in that UFO that flew over my car at 30 feet was giving me a reminder or checking in on me. I mean, he just felt this intuitively. And Owen had never, he said prior to that sighting, he didn't give a damn about UFOs. He didn't think about it. He didn't care about it. And then Curtis A., who's a very colorful rock and roll singer here, he had a very dramatic possible abduction experience. He thinks it was an abduction in Wisconsin, coming home from a gig with some fellow bandmates. And that both of those anecdotal stories are related in the book. So, I also wanted to tackle the kind of deplorable way the media has really handled this, which brings us to your last question. The 2017, in the history of this issue, will be a historical benchmark, because the New York Times came out with a full-page front page, not full page, front page story on the secret Pentagon study that had been funded to the tune of $22 million. It went on from about 2007 to 2010, and then it ran out of money and it wasn't refunded. It was done under cover of night, if you will, in a black budget, spearheaded by Nevada Senator Henry Reid, the late Henry Reid, and Lou Elizondo, who's become now kind of the poster boy for disclosure in this current environment, this current climate that we're in, headed that program. And, you know, when you get a front page story like that in the New York Times, which for years either refused to report on this, or when it did, it just took as many pot shots at it, calling into question the people who had a sighting or the information that they were getting about different incidents in history of ufology. They didn't once use the term conspiracy or conspiracy theorist or theory. It was quite refreshing, and it really opened the floodgates for other media to cover this subsequently. And if you didn't have any UFO reporting in the years between 2017 and the current phase, you were definitely out of step, because I mean, you can just do a Google search and see how much mainstream news reporting has been ongoing since then. And as you alluded to earlier, we've had one official congressional hearing on this in May earlier this year. And I keep reading that there's going to be probably another one before the holiday recess in Washington in mid-December.
Wow, cool.
So we're watching for that. And apparently there's another another report due. There was a report that came out from the Defense Department intelligence sector in June of last year. It was a whole 9 pages. Obviously, there was a classified component of that, which was probably substantially longer. And I'm hoping, like hell, it gets leaked at some point, because the stuff that came out in the 9 pages available to the public, and that was a real nothing burger. There was not a lot there other than to admit, like, we looked at 145 cases, 144 we could not resolve what they were, and yet they never wanted to call it extraterrestrial. I mean, they're doing a lot of very dainty stepping around this, like, we need the proof. Well, I think they're UFO researchers have established long ago that these things are extraterrestrial. In fact, there's a quote in the book, and it's fairly famous among UFO researchers. I'm going to look at my notes here so I get this right. If I can find it.
Go for it.
It's from General Nathan Twining, who in 1947, after Roswell, a couple months after Roswell, basically said, these things are interplanetary, they are not fictitious or visionary, or words to that effect. I mean, that's on the record. That came from a FOIA document that a UFO researcher unearthed years ago. And, that's the kind of historical military person going on the record, or at least internally, and that's available now to the public. I mean, you can find that quote anywhere if you look for it.
I will pop it up I'll pop it up on screen now for people who are watching. So, just you bring up Roswell, then actually, what was your view on the whole Roswell thing? For me, it's I was never really kind of fascinated with it at the time, but I've become more recently fascinated. I forget his name, the gentleman who claims to have worked on the gravity engine, which is really interesting, because when you look at all these descriptions of these reports by these RF pilots of how these things move and also how they can just be still in 120 knot winds, it really kind of parallels to some of the discussion out there around the type of engine. But do you have a view on Roswell and what was there, what wasn't there, what was being hidden?
Yeah, I'm pretty much convinced Roswell did in fact happen, and there were bodies recovered from the crash. It's interesting, the government, since 1947, with the alleged Roswell crash, issued 4 different reports on what it was. And each time it was different. It's like, well, you've given us 4 scenarios historically. Which one are we supposed to believe or buy? That said, I met Jesse Marcel Jr., who was the son of Jesse Marcel Sr., who appeared in all the photographs with, I forget the guy's name, on the front page of papers all over, holding this recovered debris of this craft, allegedly the skin of the craft, which apparently had some really interesting properties. You could crumble it up and then it would pop back into shape, and even though it seemed flimsy, it was sturdy as hell. You couldn't penetrate it with anything. Well, Jesse Marcel Sr. brought pieces of this home to his wife and his young child and showed it to them, including a piece of, I think it was metal that had some symbols engraved on it.
Yeah, I remember this story. Yeah.
Yeah. And, I met Jesse Marcel Jr. Several times during my work with Greer's organization. He was part of our Project Starlight early mid 90s disclosure effort in Washington. I mean, this guy is the salt of the earth. He was a military man himself. I forget his rank. He was a medical officer, and he actually re-upped to go into the Iraqi theater during the Iraqi war. I mean, if you're going to disbelieve a guy like this, I don't know who you're going to trust. But I think Roswell happened. It's become the Rosetta Stone of the UFO world. It's the it's kind of the thing everyone trots out when they report on UFOs and UFO events. It's the 75th year anniversary of Roswell. So.
Well, maybe we'll get disclosure. That would be the ultimate disclosure, wouldn't it? I mean, if they just kind of reeled out a ship and some mummies, or I don't know, from the Roswell site, I can't see it happening. But
yeah, I don't think that's coming. But it's also the 70th anniversary year of the Washington D.C. flyovers in July of 1950, when on 3 separate nights these things flew over the United States Capitol, and it caused a huge. I mean, I would have loved to have been inside the Pentagon at the top levels when this was happening, because I think probably everybody's hair was on fire each of those nights. President Truman was in office at that point, and there was such an outcry in the media. I mean, there's you can find photographs of this. And
yeah, I've seen it.
I did a blog post about this. I'm kind of extended the book into my blog that's on the book's website, thespacepenclub.com, for anybody that wants to follow the blog. Try to stay current on everything that's happening. And I've posted that image there with that blog back in late July, early August. But there was such an outcry when these 3 incidents happened in D.C., that the Air Force convened the largest press conference it had ever held since World War II, just to calm people the hell down and say, well, it was a weather inversion. And you see that a lot when the debunking's being done. I mean, you're gonna get weather inversion, a misperception of it. It was the planet Venus rising or setting. I mean, there's no end to the excuses, some of which now are pretty flimsy when you look at them.
Yeah, what we need is one of these things to happen like that with the whole kind of world of iPhones that we have now, because of course virtually everyone has a camera in their pocket these days, and I do wonder whether that is what may happen at some point. I do hope so, because it would be I think much more relevant and satisfying if true, disclosure the wrong word, but the best evidence came from Joe Bloggs walking down the street and had nothing to do with government. And because why should it be to do with government, frankly, if someone's coming here from somewhere billions of light years away, it really is not going to be looking for the leader necessarily.
We just had this conversation the other night during a presentation I did with a legendary broadcaster downtown in a place called the Minneapolis Club, and we both wholeheartedly agree a true disclosure is going to have to come from what I call the boys upstairs.
Yeah, right.
That was kind of my chauvinistic shorthand for whoever these interstellar visitors are. And we can hold as many witness driven disclosure events with evidence and FOIA documents that you can imagine, but I think until we have the cooperation of whoever it is that's coming here, it's not going to be a true disclosure. It's got to be from both sides.
I was interested to ask about Greer, obviously, and I watched his most recent movie recently. The bit in the book that stuck out to me, I found it really interesting when you did the job with CBS, which was an absolute muck up on, I don't know, muck up's the wrong word, but it was so annoying because I was so excited the way you were describing what happened, and then so frustrated with the way they covered it in the media. And I don't think we want to go into whatever reasons they did, but I'm more interested to hear your experience of that. From what I remember reading the book, so you were driving at the time, weren't you, when the lights came down at the back, which to me looked very much like all of the videos you see with Greer and teams when they're doing the C5 stuff. And can you just talk us through that experience? Because I found that really stuck with me when I was reading the book.
The Mexican adventure?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a whole chapter on that. I think it's, let me look at my chapter menu here. Chapter 7, Under the Volcano with CBS's 48 Hours, give or take a day or two.
Cool.
Greer has this, the CE5 initiative, for people that don't know, it's the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative, human-initiated contact with the visitors. And it involves real-time research. It's an experimental, visionary initiative where you try to vector in visiting craft from wherever they're coming using remote viewing, light signaling, and they used to use audio tones. I don't of a ledge down craft. I don't know if they still do that. I haven't been involved with Greer for over 20 years, and only spoken to him once in that time. I sent him a book and an engraved space pen. But another facet of CSETI is the Rapid Mobilization Investigative Team, RMIT, which he would send out into areas like the volcano zone in Mexico, where there's been just a ton of activity. I mean, there's been a ton of UFO activity in Mexico since a total eclipse down there in the early 90s, I think 1991. And when that happened, the skies over Mexico, including Mexico City, which is, one of the largest cities in the world, people were seeing these objects all over the place, in the city, out in rural areas. And even after the darkness lifted, people in subsequent days were seeing them during daylight, which is pretty profound. So our team was aware of this at CSETI, and Greer made at least two RMIT visits to the volcano zone. And I went on the second one. We also had with us, shadowing us, a news team from the CBS program 48 Hours. and they were doing a special on it, and we were going to be one of 4 segments. Well, we were all excited by this because I'd sent the executive producer all this information, all this video of these sightings that had occurred during the blackout of the eclipse. And I, provided her obviously with all the background on CSETI and the CE5 initiative. And we get down there, and the reporter for that segment, Harold Dow, and his producer broke down in a city 20 miles away from where we were, further out in the country. And it's like, well, why didn't you guys take a cab? I mean, I think CBS could probably spring for that, or even rent a car from there, 20 miles away. But the first night out, we were with their camera guy and their sound guy, who were hired freelancers from LA, and they were with us. We were not driving. We were in a location facing the volcano, and the volcano is probably 20, 25 miles in the distance. It's a massive structure. It's a beautiful Mount Popo, as the locals call it. The Aztec word for it is Popocatépetl, I think, although I probably slaughtered the pronunciation there. But Mount Popo is an active volcano, 3rd largest in the world. The thing tends to blow up every now and then, so it's there. You can't fly through that area. There's another dormant sister volcano right to the, I think, to the west of it, and we were out there before we even started our contact protocol system. I noticed an object coming out of the sky behind us at about 2:00, and it was coming, I would guess, a mile away. It was amber in color when I first saw it. As it moved closer, it was all white. It seemed to be translucent. So we signaled it. I told the guys to roll film, which they did, and we signaled it twice, and it signaled back to us in response, which Greer liked to call a photon dialogue, a light dialogue. And then the object eventually went down behind the landscape. In fact, it almost looked like it went into the landscape. We couldn't really tell because it now had moved behind another mound of earth. So this was all on tape, and that's the only real thing of substance they showed during this broadcast when it aired about a month later nationwide. And it's odd because there was no context provided for it. They used it as the opening sequence of our segment, and then they proceeded to make us look like idiots. No context to why we were there. All the Mexican sightings, which, by the way, have been covered pretty thoroughly, openly in the Mexican media. The Mexicans have a wonderful name for the UFOs. They call them the ovnis, the unknowns, which I think is just a wonderful expression, much more interesting than UFO or UAP, as it's now been rebranded. I guess that's like going from Coke to Coke Zero, but we'll see how well it works. I still prefer UFO or the unknowns. So it was a big disappointment. That said, the second night out, there was a lot of high strangeness stuff going on when we got to our location again, and now we were with Mr. Dow and his producer. They had finally gotten their car repaired, and they were on site, and this guy seemed like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world except there. It's like he must have gotten the short straw for this assignment. I think he thought the whole thing was bunk, even though he had conducted a really good 1-hour interview with Greer. And Steve Greer is, he's articulate as hell, and his assessments and analysis, to me, I still think are very right on the money. although he's a very polarizing figure. He was a pariah when I met him, coming at it as a freelance journalist before I became his publicist. He's even more of a pariah now that he's an internationally known figure. But none of the interview that I can remember made it into the segment, and it just seemed to be like a whitewashing of the whole thing. And the whole chapter, that whole chapter centers around that experience, but it's also takes to task the way media has
Yeah.
covered this historically.
Yeah, it was a
And
real shame reading it. I mean, I was reading it, what was a real shame is I'm reading it going, oh, I can't, as I'm going through it, thinking, I can't wait to go and watch this. And then I was like, oh, and then you get to how the media covered it, because your portrayal of what was going on versus what was then edited was, it was so disappointing. Because it was an opportunity. It was a real opportunity to show something of real, genuine credibility, covered by presumably CBS camera guys who weren't ufologists or whatever, So, yeah,
it's interesting because when Dow and his producer arrived at our nighttime location, it was still light out, but we were seeing light flashes on the ground all around us. Very strange. I mean, I still don't know what that was, and I don't know that anybody else in our team, including Steven, knew what they were. But then we noticed that the lip of the volcano, there was a light that sort of came around the rim and then went back, and it came around again and went back. It was like, hey, here we are. It was like playing peekaboo with us. And Harold Dow saw that and he goes, what the hell is that? I said, I don't know, but maybe we can signal it to come visit us, or something, words to that effect. And I'm sure that guy still has thoughts of this today, because
yeah, I bet.
he was definitely freaked out by it.
Was Greer using the C5 protocol, if I get the wording right, which this whole kind of process he uses through meditation and connecting on really another dimension with these beings to invite them in. Is that what he was doing back then, or has that been more recent? Has he been doing that for that long?
It's called the Contact Trilogy, and it uses the system he's devised, and he's come out about it now that this was a technique that he was taught by some beings that he encountered as a teenager hiking in the mountains around Asheville, and it uses consciousness as and thought as a means to connect or remote view wherever these objects or beings might be at any given place in the universe. So what happens during a night under the stars with CSETI is you have a group here. It's set up as a meditation, but I think that's just the technique.
Yeah.
But you have coherent thoughts projected out into the universe by this group, trying to indicate where you are on what landmarks you might be by, and you're sending this out as a thought package almost, a thought bubble going out.
Yeah.
And the first few times I engaged in it, I thought, this is the stupidest thing I've ever done. Over time, I came to think this is not only the stupidest thing I've ever done, it's also one of the most profound and fascinating things I've ever done.
Yeah, right.
And it produced some interesting results over time. And he continues to teach people to do this all over the world. There are CSETI working groups in Japan, Germany, England, South America, all across the United States. And in addition to the people doing the coherent thought sequencing process, you have the light signalers, and then you have people just watching the skies. So it's an interesting mixture of modalities, if you will.
Yeah, it's interesting, and there's some really fascinating video evidence showing what it brings back. I mean, when you look at the latest, I think it's the latest movie,
Close
which
Encounters of the Fifth Kind,
which was
which
a couple of years ago, right?
is,
It wasn't. It was very recent, I think.
yeah, I think it's 2 years old now. Which I don't know when your show is going to air, but it's that all of Greer's films this week are airing for free on Tubi.
This week or next week? So we're on
This
Friday.
week right now, we're in
Okay,
Fridays, probably
bit too
through the
late.
weekend.
Yeah. Okay. If I can get it out, I'll get it out and I can notify everyone. But so they're all airing free through Tubi till the end of the week.
Yeah,
Cool. Well, it's I watched it. I watched it a few weeks ago, and I mean, I have exactly the same. I'm having not done the CE5 protocol. I still have exactly the same kind of reflection on it. It just seems nuts and crazy, and almost like you're going to some kind of hippie boot camp thing. But on the other side, you go, well, actually, it makes perfect sense because, really, if we're dealing with entities that have traversed billions of light years in some way, then it makes, for me, there is absolute logic in thinking there is a consciousness level to this process in terms of how the travel happens. How that happens, I know Greer makes some pretty bold statements around the actual process, and that's completely beyond me. But for me, it's very logical, though, to think of mind and kind of the singularity of consciousness and how we are ever going to traverse these vast distances.
yeah. Well, obviously, someone has figured it out. I want to read a quote from the book from Colonel John Alexander, and this is from his book, UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities. Alexander writes, and this addresses your last point and also underscores, I think, the whole Stephen Greer vision of this. We agree that at times hard physical craft exist, but there's much more to the phenomena. Unfortunately, the true boundaries are unknown. It seems certain that human consciousness is at least part of the formula. Now, Alexander, I've heard from reliable sources that Alexander and Greer do not get along at any level, and Steve would probably take that a step further, but I'm not going there. But anyway, I think Greer is so far out in his estimation of what this is about and how we can make true contact without governments or military or intel agencies being involved. It just seems like it's going to be perceived by people who are very new to ufology as just being crazy, just nutso stuff. But the further you get into it and understand it, and the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind film is a good introduction to it,
Yeah.
the more, if nothing else, it's great food for thought, and it does tend to make sense. So, that's what appealed to me when I was approached to profile him and his organization in a freelance piece that I was never able to sell back in the 90s. Today I could publish it in 50 different UFO sites and make $10 on it, but back then nobody was buying UFOs, and now it's become part of the mainstream lexicon.
Yeah, who knows where we'll be 10 years from now, so or 100, we'll see. But just as we close, and I mean, your book, for me, what I really enjoyed is it didn't answer anything, and I think that for me is kind of important. Maybe that goes back to one of the first questions around, why was it different? It's not saying this is what it is, this is what is it. It just was an account, a memoir of obviously everything you've done,
Yeah.
and for that reason, it kind of left me with more questions, which is a good thing, I think. Sometimes, I mean, frankly, we should have way more questions about this. But from your point of view, when you look at how the experiences you've had, being around Greer, what you've kind of decided might be true, what isn't, do you think that there is a kind of definitive answer here, or do you think this could be a host of different answers? So yes, there are UFOs, there are extraterrestrials visiting us. They could be from all sorts of different systems, but there could also be other stuff that is more, conscious based. There could be AI based stuff. Do you have any kind of, I know there's a lot in there, but yeah, what is your kind of overall assessment of
Well,
looking at this
I,
stuff?
I think you just kind of encapsulated what might be out there. I mean, I think it's probably all of that. I think there's, we're in kindergarten in terms of understanding quantum
Yeah.
mechanics first. The Nobel Peace Prize in Science was just awarded to three guys who proved quantum entanglement, which is something Einstein explored, 70 years ago. But there's just so much stuff that doesn't fit into our baskets. We're taught these things. We're taught basic sciences. We're taught, space is comprised of all these stars and gases, and there's black holes, there's wormholes. But I don't think we know what some of these manifestations are. I mean, aside from them being probably interstellar, some of them. My favorite quote from the book, and you can probably find this in other books, but it's almost 100 years old. It comes from a British geneticist, evolutionary biologist, and mathematician named J.B.S. Haldane, who in 1927 said, "The universe is not only stranger than we suppose, but stranger than we can suppose." And that's kind of where I like to leave things. I mean, I think that's exactly the right place to be. It leaves the door open for future understanding, for future knowledge, future breakthroughs in astrophysics, and possibly maybe a breakthrough with the boys upstairs in a true disclosure moment with this planet.
Let's hope so. Well, look, man, I've really enjoyed chatting. If it wasn't the end of my kind of working week and the end of a Friday, I'd go on for another hour. But yeah, the only tricky thing with these podcasts is finding the right time zone. Maybe we'll have to do the Greer thing next time and meet on a different plane. But yeah, I mean, hopefully we can do this again, because actually, it'd be great to do another hour. And I know mates that will listen to this are going to have questions that they would have liked me to ask. So, but look, really appreciate you joining the pod. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And like I said, you can follow the blog and learn more about the book at thespacepenclub.com. You can order it on Amazon. It's a pretty easy process. And keep an open mind. We're in interesting times, and we'll see what the next thing is.
We will do indeed. For everyone watching or listening, I will leave all of those notes on where to find out more about Martin, about the book, within the notes on the podcast. So cool. Have a great day, Martin. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir, and have a good evening.
Cheers.
The two were Muhammad Ali and Sonny Barger, the president of the Hells Angels.
This is 1095.
It's also been reported that there have been UAP observed and interacting with and flying over sensitive military facilities, particularly, and not just ranges, but some facilities housing our strategic nuclear forces. One such incident allegedly occurred at Malmstrom Air Force Base, in which 10 of our nuclear ICBMs were rendered inoperable. At the same time, a glowing red orb was observed overhead. I'm not commenting on the accuracy of this. I'm simply asking you whether you're aware of it and whether you have any comment on the accuracy of that report.
Let me pass that to Mr. Bray. You've been looking at UAPs over the last 3 years.
That data is not within the holdings of the UAP task force.
Okay, but are you aware of the report, or that the data exists somewhere?
I have heard stories. I have not seen the official data on that.
So you've just seen informal stories, no official assessment that you've done or exists within DoD that you're aware of regarding the Malmstrom incident?
All I can speak to is what's within my cognizance of the UAP task force, and we have not looked at that incident.
Well, I would say, it's a pretty high-profile incident. I don't claim to be an expert on this, but that's out there in the ether. you're the guys investigating it. I mean, who else is doing it?
If something was officially brought to our attention, we would look at it. There are many things that are out there in the ether that aren't officially brought to our attention.
So how would it have to be officially brought to your
Usually
attention?
it's
I'm bringing it to your attention.
so-
This is pretty official.
Sure. So we'll go back and take a look at it, but generally there is some authoritative figure that says there is an incident that occurred. We'd like you to look at this. But in terms of just tracking what may be in the media that says that something occurred at this time, at this place, there are probably a lot of leads that we would have to follow up on. I don't think we are resourced to do that right now.
Well, I don't claim to be an authoritative figure, but for what it's worth, I would like you to look into it. And
Sure.
if for no other reason, you could dismiss it and say this is not worth wasting resources on.
Will do.
And then finally,